How would our next two witnesses wish to be known?
Malcolm and Violet.
Malcolm and Violet, please.
Please state your name.
Malcolm James Slater.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please state your name.
Violet Slater.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Violet and Malcolm, you met in 1978 and married in 1980.
Yes,
And Malcolm, you have haemophilia A, classified as mild to moderate.
correct.
And that was diagnosed when you were a baby.
Yes, yes.
How did it affect you when you were growing up?
Well, I wasn't allowed to join in PE at school or any physical games, cricket, football, rugby. I was allowed to go swimming when other people were having a time on a very cold rugby field. But I had to take care not to hit the end of the pool.
And you describe in your statement that you missed quite a lot of school growing up.
Yes, I did.
The treatment that you received at that time in your childhood and young adulthood would be bed rest, sometimes blood transfusions,
Yes,
and fresh frozen plasma,
and later cryo.
and later on cryoprecipitate.
Yes.
And you spent a fair amount of time in hospital.
Yes, indeed. King's College Hospital, usually.
We'll come on to the particular circumstances in which you received factor VIII in the 80s in a moment, but in your statement you describe factor VIII as seeming to be a massive improvement because you didn't have to stay in bed for prolonged periods of time or in hospital.
Yes, and it meant I was able to get back to classes and not fall behind. Yeah.
Now, despite missing school, you managed to do your A-levels, you went to university to study law,
Yes.
and you qualified as a solicitor.
Yes.
And you tried to lead in adulthood an active and normal life.
I took up horse riding, which was my first sport, other than swimming alone in a pool. But the doctors weren't very pleased when I took up horse riding. It was a complete novice. But I took up jumping the horses and countryside.
And you tried to ensure that your haemophilia didn't affect your work. You'd take days off if you had to as holiday rather than sick leave.
Yes, mostly, yes. Yes, sometimes it had to be sick leave.
And Violet, you described Malcolm as being at this stage really healthy.
Absolutely. I met Malcolm and he told me about haemophilia and I thought, oh, this is a bit worrying. But over the first few years of our lives together, I thought, don't see what the problem is. You know, he's off riding horses on Frensham Common for most of the day, you know. Fact is, you know, sometimes he wasn't walking very well afterwards. But he seemed to enjoy life. We had our dog, which we walked constantly. She always had to be walked on a lead, which meant that, you know, it's quite a big dog. We had to go for fairly long walks. We explored the Cotswolds where we lived, and life was really good.
And you were working at this stage, Malcolm, for a large life insurance and pensions company as an in-house legal advisor in Swindon.
In-house solicitor for the company, yes.
Now, in your witness statement, Malcolm, you mentioned receiving factor 8 on many occasions from the 1970s onwards.
There was a gap. I think it was probably 6-8 years when I didn't take it, largely because I was concerned about it.
Well, we'll have a look at a letter first of all, and then I'll ask you about that. It's a letter that Violet has recently found in your medical records. Henry, it's 00599-007, please. And we can see it's a letter dated the 27th of October 1981. It's from Dr. Ritzer to your GP. And it says this in the second paragraph. It says you were diagnosed as a haemophiliac in early childhood because of excessive bruising and bleeding into his knee joints. Throughout his early days, he bled into knees, ankles, elbows and hips, and following dental extraction, he's bled for as long as 8 weeks.
It also should mention hands, sometimes elbows.
Then it refers to several episodes of hematuria, bleeding from the gastrointestinal tract. And then it says this: apart from his haemophilia, his past health has been good, and he has had no factor 8 replacement therapy since 1974. And that's the gap. From 1974 to 1981, you didn't have factor 8.
Yeah.
And you said just now you had concerns about it.
Yes, the stories, rumours were going around a bit. And, yeah, I was very reluctant.
And then if we go on in this letter, we can see in the bottom paragraph, it refers to your factor level and being a moderately severely affected haemophiliac. And it says this: with this level of factor 8, he will require fairly close watching and frequent monitoring of the factor 8 in his blood post-operatively. Our usual routine in such cases is as follows. Immediately before operation, we give a dose of factor 8 sufficient to raise the blood level of factor 8 to 80 to 100% of normal. 4 to 6 hours, we take a sample of blood to check the level of factor 8 and give further doses that day depending on the results of our assays. Thereafter, we shall probably give him twice daily doses of factor 8, aiming to maintain his factor 8 level above 50% of normal for the next 7 to 10 days. I see no problem in doing all of this at the Ackland. Now, this refers to surgery that you were going to have and did have in November of 1981.
Varicose vein surgery, yes.
It was undertaken at the Ackland Hospital, which was a private Nuffield Trust facility, but your haemophilia care was based at the Churchill Hospital in Oxford under Dr. Ritzer.
Yes.
And as we can see from this, arrangements were made for factor 8 to be administered to you pre- and post-operatively.
Yes.
Were you given by Dr. Ritzer or any of the other doctors involved any information, advice or warning about risks of infection from the factor product?
I don't remember any.
Indeed, your statement says that you'd been assured by Dr. Ritzer at some stage at least that factor 8 was safe.
Yes, he was very positive about improvements and how the treatments were developing rapidly. Yeah.
And you also say very firmly in your statement that had you been told that there was a risk of infection, you simply wouldn't have gone ahead with the operation because it wasn't an essential one.
It wasn't urgent, essential, no.
Violet, you described the operation as going well. Malcolm came home and was back at work as soon as he could. But then he became sick quite quickly after the operation. What can you recall about his symptoms?
I think Malcolm always had a healthy appetite. And he wasn't enjoying Christmas. He didn't enjoy food at Christmas. And my recollection really is that he started feeling nauseous. Then he started to be sick, and he had constant diarrhea, and he was losing weight. He was confused. And sometime afterwards, he started getting joint pains.
More. I already had joint pains, but more so.
We were always able to do walks, but not very long after that, that started to reduce.
And you've recollected in your statement Malcolm being told words to the effect that he had hepatitis or jaundice. There are a couple of letters in your medical records that we're going to look at. Henry, can we have up on screen, please, 0599003? This is a letter of the 27th of January 1982. So this is not long after the operation, which was in November 81, when you had the Factor VIII products administered. And it's from Dr. Trowell to your GP, Dr. Winter, and it says this: I was asked to see this young man as he's developed abnormal liver function tests since the end of last year. As you know, he had an episode of diarrhoea while in Tunisia last October, but this settled, and he was admitted to the Auckland in November for operation on his varicose veins. This is very satisfactory, but it is possible that he has developed a non-A, non-B hepatitis as a result of the Factor VIII cover he received at that time. His liver function tests became abnormal during December and are now very strikingly so, with an AST on his last visit of greater than 630. He had a bilirubin which had risen from levels below 9 to 20. He himself has developed symptoms with anorexia and nausea, vomiting after fatty food, and also had noticed that his eyes were yellow last week, although he claimed that this had now cleared. When I examined him, he was not noted to be jaundiced. I elicited no abnormal physical signs. Now, just pausing there for a moment, that is, I think, a reasonably accurate description of the symptoms that you were experiencing at the time.
Yes.
The letter then goes on to say this: I've told Mr. Slater that I think he has hepatitis. It is impossible to say whether this is the result of his Factor VIII cover or of his trip to North Africa, but it could well be the former. He must expect that in view of the abnormal liver function tests, his health will be impaired for between 3 and 6 months. I've advised him to plan his professional activities accordingly. And then it says this: I have also advised him to avoid alcohol, and I know that he has already cut down considerably on his alcohol consumption. Now, if we just look at the very bottom of the page, I believe this is your handwriting, where you write Dr. Trowell is in Fantasyland.
Yes, that's my writing.
My alcohol consumption was very little, except on one occasion in 1970 or 1980. Now, you saw this letter relatively recently, I think in the last year or so, when preparing statements for the inquiry.
Yes.
What was your reaction on seeing this reference to alcohol consumption?
I was livid. And I remain pretty angry about it. I have had alcohol to excess, yes, once. And it probably wasn't that much because I haven't had much. It was, if I was out with friends, it might be just a half a pint.
Just if I may interpose, just so that the transcript gets it right, I think Ms. Richards put to you 1970 or 1980. It's actually 79 or 80.
Sorry, yes,
which
1979.
is one episode on either that date or the other date.
Yes.
That was on a trip to Ireland?
No, sorry, I'm interrupting here.
No.
It's when my cousins came to visit, and they were a very bad influence.
Yes.
But you've described yourself in the statement, Violet, of the two of you, you're the person who will enjoy a drink from time to time.
Absolutely.
Malcolm never has been.
No.
No.
To the extent that when you were given some champagne, I think for your 30th birthday, it was decades later that it was finally opened for your son's engagement, and Malcolm only had a sip.
Yes, that's correct. I managed the rest.
So this suggestion, or the inference in the letter from Dr. Trowell, that you need to cut down considerably on your alcohol consumption is just plain wrong.
Absolutely. I was very angry about it. So angry, elsewhere in the paperwork, I've described Dr. Trowell as a woman, I think.
No, as a man, in fact, she's a woman.
Yes, it was the other way around, yes.
And Violet, you've confirmed in your statement that what Malcolm says is absolutely correct. He was a very occasional drinker who became a non-drinker.
He became a non-drinker until about 4 weeks ago, when we were on holiday in Croatia and I lost my handbag, including our passports.
And that was the first drink.
Which drove him to having half a pint.
Now, there's a second letter from Dr. Chow that a year later. Henry, it's 0599004, please. 31st of January 1983. We'll come back to your annotations in a moment. We'll just read the letter first of all. Again, it's Dr. Chow to Dr. Winter. It says, I was asked to see Mr. Slater again because his liver function test has been intermittently abnormal since his episode of hepatitis. The results from December and from last week show that he has an ALT of greater than 200, although he's not jaundiced. His symptoms obviously fluctuate. I think that he was unwell with nausea and vomiting intermittently during the month before I saw him. There is also no doubt that he's still sensitive to increased quantities of fat in his diet, and I think finds it difficult to remain with any strict dietary regime, or in fact to give up alcohol for any significant period of time. Both of these may to some extent influence his symptoms, and I think that the amount of alcohol he consumes could explain to some extent his slow recovery. However, we found that patients with this non-A, non-B hepatitis sometimes run symptoms over many months before they subside, and I hope that he is coming towards the end of this period. Now, by this time, as I understand it, you are actually finding it difficult to consume any liquid apart from bottled water,
Yes,
let alone alcohol.
certainly not alcohol.
And we see your annotation in the left-hand column, rubbish,
Yes,
exclamation mark.
I'm sorry, I wrote those annotations, if you like, for my benefit. I hadn't thought of it ever becoming public, as it were.
Well, they show your response on seeing these letters.
Correct.
You also have noted at the top of the page that, in fact, I had lost a lot of weight. My clothes were then too big.
Yes. Yes, but much too big.
So, again, the reference to alcohol consumption here is simply incorrect.
It's fiction.
And in terms of the reference to diet, you had, in fact, been consuming a very healthy diet for a period of time by that stage.
Yes, and in fact, by this stage, I wasn't eating much.
I think Malcolm's looking at me now. I had worked in the NHS and I'd worked with a dietitian devising menus for people who were ill, and I had decided he was so ill that we better really adapt our diet. And I think his diet was mainly fish and vegetables. He had been toying, well, he'd been trying very hard actually to get me to, as the family cook, to cook only vegetarian meals for him, and I had agreed I would do that at weekends. But because he was ill, I conceded that probably it would be a really good idea for him to cut out cheese and meat and eat what he would like to eat anyway, which was fish and vegetables mainly, and to cut out fat, which I knew from my work experience was only going to make the situation worse.
So any suggestion in this letter that you were struggling to remain with a strict dietary regime, again, is incorrect.
Correct.
The words used there start with the words "I think." So plainly, this is nothing you said to the doctor. It's not reporting what you were saying.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know where she got this from.
But it's her supposition.
Correct. I must assume so.
And you've said in your second statement, Malcolm, commenting on these letters, my immediate reaction when you saw these letters more recently was that they were passing the buck or trying to cover this up.
Yes.
It's right, I should say, we have a statement from Dr. Trow. It will be published on the inquiry's website. She has no independent recollection of the letters or appointments, but I will just read out what she says, and it's also right to note that she apologises for causing distress to you and your wife in the letters. She says, my normal practice when seeing any patient with abnormal liver function was to take a full medical and personal history, and as alcohol can cause liver disease, I would routinely ask a patient what alcohol they drank, and she says she'd record this in her notes and in a letter to the general practitioner. She says, I would not have had any reason to record any other alcohol consumption and would never have considered fabricating this. She says, in my inquiries and in recording what alcohol a patient drank, I was documenting something which might be contributing to their liver dysfunction and ill health. I would advise reducing or abstaining from alcohol to improve their health and survival. This improvement could occur even in haemophiliac patients such as Mr. Slater, for whom the main cause of his illness, as my letter records, was the hepatitis virus. And then she says this, I would routinely advise patients with haemophilia who had abnormal liver function to reduce their alcohol intake. And she says that even if their consumption of alcohol was very moderate. So I just read that out as a matter of completeness of the record.
From that, it would seem that she would normally record the amount of alcohol that the patient said they were taking, which doesn't sit very well with the words I think.
No, and I think it's right, Malcolm, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have, or you don't have, the records from the Churchill, or very many records from the Churchill Hospital.
Very, very little, although I used to see them quite a lot. See the doctors, Dr. Ritzer and Dr. Trout, primarily, and Matthews.
And you've tried to get those records, but you've been sent what they say they have, and it's far from complete.
They just sent some test results, which many of which were illegible. Pretty meaningless to me.
Now, in either 1982 or 1983, something rather unusual started happening. You started receiving home visits from staff from the Oxford Haemophilia Centre.
Yes.
Malcolm, you've estimated this was sometime in 1982. Violet, you've put it as early 1983 because you think it was when you were pregnant.
That's correct. I mean, it's a long time ago and it's difficult to pin it down. But, yes, I think it was early 1983.
Whichever year it was,
Yes.
Malcolm, first of all, what can you tell us about these visits?
They were home visits because I was quite unwell. I was on sick leave. And the hospital was about an hour away. But I don't know if a GP was involved. I simply can't remember so far back. But yes, the team, initially there were 2 people came to the house. I think we were expecting them, so they made an appointment, I guess. They wouldn't say why, other than they were taking blood. But
They did say they were
It's
doing
research.
important research.
Yes, but no, nothing about the research. It was all a bit of a mystery.
They would take samples of your blood.
Yes.
They would take samples of Violet's blood, which puzzled both of you because Violet does not have haemophilia and did not receive blood products. They would ask you questions about your health. What were they wearing?
I recall sometimes they were wearing, I think, blue protective suits, which they changed on arrival. And I think one had sort of clear plastic protection for eyes, I think.
Yes, I recall them coming into the house wearing normal dress and putting a bag on the floor, and it was in our living room, which had floor-to-ceiling windows and a neighbour just behind. And then they proceeded to open the bag, take out these, what I call scene of crime outfits, and put them on. And I remember thinking, this is crazy, you know. They've come to talk to us about research which would help haemophiliacs. What's going on here? I was also shocked when they asked for my blood, and I wasn't that willing to give it to them because, you know, my veins are like spiders' legs, you know, and people struggle to get my blood. And the reason I think I was pregnant at the time was, you know, I had my blood taken probably once a month at antenatal. You know, they've got my blood, why do you need it? But we never got a satisfactory answer apart from sort of a pat on the back, and this will be really helpful for haemophiliacs in the future. That's my memory.
Yes.
Do you recall?
And I was relaxed in a sense, because if it was going to lead to better treatment for haemophiliacs, yeah, fine, they could have as much as they liked from me.
You describe in your statement, Malcolm, your recollection that it was, to start with, these were fairly frequent visits, perhaps once a week or once a fortnight.
I think so.
Then they became less frequent, perhaps monthly.
Yes.
And after you returned to work, the visits continued, but to you in your workplace.
Yes.
And you continued to have blood samples taken for unknown research
Yes, but
purposes.
they didn't wear the protective clothing then, because that would have excited interest at my office.
And to this day, neither of you know why that was being done.
Correct.
Eventually, there came a point at which you, Violet, said no to any more blood being taken from you.
I think they only took my blood 2 or 3 times, and they were coming in the evening after work. And I think that may be because the company I was working for would certainly not have given me time off to go to Oxford. I'm trying to think why they came at night as opposed to during the day. And then when I said, well, I'm not giving you mine anymore, I'm not a haemophiliac, you know, then maybe that's when they decided to go to Malcolm's office instead. Although I think Malcolm had already had blood taken at the office for testing his liver levels when he was first ill in 1982. So we think that maybe twice people came, and 2 different groups of people maybe came to his office.
Yes.
Now, you
They
both...
came several visits, certainly several, 3, 4 visits at least to me at work. Yeah.
And eventually, you've said in your statement that the visits petered out.
Yes.
Now, you both recall a Sunday morning when your wife came back from going out to buy some sausages, for you rather than for Malcolm, with a copy of a newspaper. You said in your statement you thought it was the Sunday Times because that was the paper you normally went to buy, but it might not have been. We looked this morning at a newspaper article, you and I, Violet, from the 1st of May, 1983, in the Mail on Sunday.
On that day, I was pregnant, and I had been sick for quite some time, and I think I was feeling better, and I thought, do you know what? I'm having sausages today. I really fancy that. So off I went to Waitrose, and I walked in the door, and I would have gone with the intention to buy the Sunday Times because that was the paper we bought every Sunday. But I recall walking in the door and stopping and looking at the newspapers, and a headline just jumped out at me that blood products were infected with a virus, words to that effect. And I know I picked up numerous papers because I thought, if this is in one paper, if it was the Daily Mail, I might have thought I might get better reporting in another paper. So I picked up and bought the Sunday Times that I intended to buy in the first instance. And I recall my legs shaking. I recall feeling physically sick and weak at reading that, and my immediate thought was, that's what the guys are testing us for. The people in the protective clothing are testing us to see if we've got whatever this is. And I walked home literally through the street in Cirencester trying to find articles in the papers, and I got to a little bridge over a small river. And I remember leaning against it and laying the papers out on the bridge. It was a nice day. and searching through the papers before I got home, and then presented them to Malcolm.
And whichever newspaper it was in, it was news about a deadly virus
Yes,
and haemophiliacs.
yes.
And this was the first time, as I understand it from your statement, Malcolm, that you began to associate your illness and the symptoms you'd had with factor VIII products. The suspicion was there as a result of reading this article.
Yes.
You describe it, Violet, as a terrible day. You thought, we've got it, they must think we have it.
And I thought, we talked about it and we thought, I wonder if we've all got it. I wonder if the baby's got it. Would it just be one of us? Would Malcolm die and I'd be left? Or could he have passed it on? Would we all get it? Who would be left?
Now, you then had a meeting at the Haemophilia Centre with Dr. Ritzer and Dr. Matthews, possibly Dr. Trowell. You've got slightly different recollections about the emphasis of that meeting, so I'm going to ask you each in turn about it. Malcolm, what's your recollection of that meeting and what you were told by Dr. Ritzer?
I felt I wasn't getting the correct story. I felt a possible cover-up. I was alarmed, so much so it put me off getting factor for a long time. And my trust had dissipated. But I think I even considered going to another hospital. But we didn't do that. We stayed with the Churchill.
And you've described in your statement being given some information at this meeting about a concern about a batch of factor VIII imported from the US that had made some people ill. And this was the issue that was being covered in the papers, and you had received some of that batch.
Yes.
You've also recorded in your statement a recollection of a discussion that you had with Dr. Ritzer about why factor VIII products were being imported from America in the first place.
Yes.
And a discussion about the different donation practices in the States and in the United Kingdom.
They're not donations in the States, mainly the people supplying the blood receive money, unlike a cup of tea and a biscuit in the UK.
And you've said in your statement, you recall Dr. Ritzer saying the situation was potentially extremely serious and that this could turn out to be a life-limiting issue for some patients.
Yes.
And you and your wife were deeply shocked at what you were hearing.
Profoundly, yes.
Your recollection in your statement, Malcolm, is that there was some discussion of non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Yes. I'm not sure if that the non-A, non-B was mentioned at that meeting or the next meeting.
So there was a meeting at some stage.
Oh, yes, at the Churchill.
In which you asked Dr. Ritzer why it wasn't called hepatitis C.
Yes.
And he responded that that will probably happen sometime in the future.
Yes, it might well happen, yes.
Violet, your recollection of the focus of the meeting was that it was about the risk of what's now known as HIV,
Yeah.
would then have been referred to as HTLV3 or AIDS.
I think what we'd picked up from the paper on the Sunday, my recollection, was that it was more about HIV. And that is what I had decided we had got. And I think I went into that room expecting to be told that we might have HIV or this virus, you know. I think I recall hearing the conversation about the infections. And in my mind, the chat was all about HIV. Malcolm believes the emphasis was possibly more on hepatitis C, but I think it was me focusing purely on what I expected to hear. But whichever they talked about, we came away knowing that it was not good news.
I think I may have sort of mentally switched off after the initial comments made by Dr. Ritzer.
But
I was shocked.
yeah, they were giving us pretty bad news.
And whether it was at that meeting or at a later meeting, Malcolm, you have a recollection, as indeed do you, Violet, of being told that Malcolm had received blood that could be infected with HIV. Others who had received it were testing positive. Malcolm did not test positive, but the tests were in their early days and you'd have to keep repeating it. And Dr. Ritzer was curious to find out why Malcolm was not showing signs of developing HIV, not coming back with a positive result when others were. Is that right?
Yes.
And
I recall being shocked to find out that they couldn't give us a definitive answer and that we would have to be retested for, at that time, I don't recall how many times they said they would have to test us, but they told us that we would have to keep being tested because I can't remember the specific words they said, but I think it was maybe that the virus was mutating and that the blood tests were not, were just being developed. And that really, although we were clear today, there was no guarantee next month that we would be.
And you have expressed in your statement, Violet, a particular concern because you'd actually had a meeting with Dr. Ritzer early in 1983 after you found out that you were pregnant.
Yes.
To discuss the genetic implications in terms of haemophilia.
Yeah.
And you've said Dr. Ritzer was very nice and you were reassured that there was nothing to worry about.
Yes. In fact, at that meeting, I recall coming away really happy. It's possibly the first time I've sat down at a meeting with Dr. Ritzer, and I felt a sense of guilt in a way that I was pregnant and I was going to have a child which would not be a haemophiliac because that's what I believed, that haemophiliacs would not have children with a bleeding disorder. It would skip a generation. And I was feeling a bit guilty that, okay, fine for me, but the child that I'm having could then have the responsibility of making decisions about having children in the future. I knew that had happened to some of Malcolm's family who'd had to make a decision not to have children because they didn't want to have a child with haemophilia. And we went across and Dr. Ritzer explained everything and he said, don't worry about it. You know, there is already the potential. This is how I'm remembering it. There is already the potential for implanting a gene in pigs that, and you know, it's developing quite quickly. And once that happens, then haemophilia really will not be a problem for anyone anymore. So I came away from that meeting feeling absolutely ecstatic and all was well.
And the question you pose in your statement is how could Dr. Ritzer give me such assurances when only months later HIV was all over the newspapers?
Absolutely. I was totally shocked that I felt I had been misled and, you know, I don't know what the outcome would have been for me if he had told me that there were risks. That's something I don't want to think about. But I had been reassured, and by the time HIV was all over the papers, I was having a baby quite soon.
Now you although your test results were coming back negative, because of what you'd been told of the uncertainty of testing or the possibility of the virus mutating and showing up later, the two of you continued to fear that Malcolm might have been infected with HIV, or indeed that you might have been, or that the baby might have been. And you've said, Malcolm, in your statement that it felt like a death threat at that stage.
Yes.
You were reading in the papers, picking up from the media about people with AIDS being stigmatised. And the two of you decided, after you had your child in 1983, at that stage, not to have any more children because you were concerned about one of you dying.
I actually got pregnant, not planned, not very long after I had Mark, and I miscarried. And I think at the time, although I was sad, I thought, I think it's for the best. We would have just been going through another 9 months of trauma, and goodness knows what the future holds for us. So no, that's it, no more children.
And it wasn't until 1988, by which time you were more confident that the repeated test results coming back negative were accurate, that the two of you decided that you would try again and complete your family.
Yes, I think we were living in Yorkshire, and we actually went back down to speak to the Churchill.
We saw Dr. Ritz, I think,
and
at that time.
Spoke to him about what the risks were for us, and I think we came away feeling a bit more confident, and that resulted in us having our daughter.
Now, as you say, you'd moved to Yorkshire. You, Malcolm, had a new job which involved commuting between York and London.
It developed into that, yes.
And then you came home late one evening. You've placed it, Violet, as late 1984. And you told Violet that you were feeling very unwell.
Apparently.
And I think you don't have much memory of what then
Not a lot,
happened, so
no.
I'm going to ask Violet to describe what happened.
It had been snowing all day, and we weren't actually living in York. We were living, I think it was 22 miles north of York, right up close to the edge of the North York Moors. And Malcolm was driving home, and I was a bit worried about how he would get home from the station to our village. And he appeared, and I think he went upstairs to change immediately. And he came back down, and he said, "I don't feel well." And I thought, "Oh, you look really awful. He was grey. He had beads of perspiration, and Malcolm is not one for allowing a doctor to come visiting. In fact, I can't remember. It's very rare, very, very rarely that a doctor has come to our house to see him. And I thought, well, I'm not asking him because he'll just say, no, leave it to tomorrow and see how I am. And I thought, well, if I leave it to tomorrow, he's not going to be here. So I found a doctor, our GP, who lived in Burbridge, which was about 3 miles away. And he said, I don't think I can get to you because of the snow, but I'll phone an ambulance from York or Harrogate and see if they can get through. And the doctor did appear. I think he got a farmer maybe to help him. I don't know how he got there, but he appeared. And by this stage, Malcolm was collapsed on the floor in our living room. And he was deteriorating before my eyes. And I recall the doctor saying, I think it's his heart. And, I think he was in his 30s then. And he injected him with adrenaline. And the ambulance appeared. And we lived in that village for a short time, and I didn't really know people. I couldn't call anyone to look after our baby. Well, he was about a year old, I think. And Malcolm went off in the ambulance, and at that point, I actually thought he's going to die before he gets to a major hospital.
He was taken to York and put into the coronary care unit. And when you got there, you were told effectively that he was displaying all the symptoms of having had a heart attack, but he hadn't had a heart attack.
Yes. They were doing enzyme tests, I think I recall, and they were sky high, and they said these tests were symptomatic of an imminent heart attack. And by now he should have, had a major coronary, but it hadn't happened.
There was talk about transferring him to Leeds for potential surgery.
Yes, famous hospital then. There used to be a television programme from it called Jimmy's, and we used to watch it on television in Yorkshire, and that was the major heart hospital in the area. And I think it was explained to me that maybe he would need surgery, and I thought, major heart surgery on a haemophiliac? I'm not liking the sound of this. And obviously it was a very, very worrying time.
But then the consultant came to you and said that they didn't think it was Malcolm's heart. It was hepatitis. He had gone yellow.
Yes. He was a very nice haematologist, and one that, for the time that we lived in York, we trusted him because he was called Dr. Cedric Wiley, and he was much more upfront about the risks. And to Malcolm, if Malcolm went along to him with the bleed, and Malcolm would invariably say, not touching that stuff, and he would sort of say, well, okay, we'll wait and see, because, it mightn't be too bad, we'll just have to monitor it. So he knew Malcolm's fear of taking factor VIII, and he had only, I think, given it to him once. And Dr. Wiley was a complete gentleman. He used to pop down and see me every day. He knew what time I came at to visit Malcolm. And on this occasion, he had said to the nurse to call him, put me in an office and call him when I arrived. And he came in and said, it's not his heart. We're pretty sure now it's not his heart. And I said, brilliant, And he said, he's turned yellow, he's got hepatitis. And I was over the moon. I got that badly wrong, actually. But at that time, I thought, well, he had that before, and I know he hasn't really got better, but he hasn't died. So, that's good news. And Dr. Wiley said to me, it isn't, I'm afraid I have a lot of concerns for his health, and he is still a very, very sick man, and you shouldn't be so optimistic about the future for him.
And you discharged home, Malcolm, but over the years that followed, you continued to experience the physical effects of hepatitis C. Tiredness, fatigue, nausea, pain, and confusion.
The nausea over time didn't cease to be a problem. You can see I've put my weight back on. But yes, other than the nausea, fatigue, very much so.
In 1990, you moved to Scotland. You got a job working for General Accident in Perth.
Now part of Aviva, yes.
And you say in your statement your health still wasn't good, but you'd got used to it to some extent by then.
Yes.
But you described then becoming increasingly exhausted, having difficulty concentrating, and feeling confusion, which was very problematic given the nature of the job that you were doing.
Very much so.
Violet, you've described Malcolm at this time as having to work all weekend to try and catch up because he couldn't get his work done during the week.
Saturday he would be fast asleep till about 11 o'clock. And he was working late every evening. He just got up, had some food, went upstairs to his study and carried on working, and he worked throughout every weekend. I used to go up, rather frustrated sometimes on a Sunday afternoon, and say to him, I'm going to such and such a place with the kids, are you going to come with us? And he would say, I have to work, I can't. I have to catch up. I'm not sort of working that capacity. And I have to keep working to, to keep my job. He was frightened that if he lost his job by not performing well, that he would not get another job because of his health record.
And you describe him as getting more and more stressed. You gave up on asking him to join in with doing things. And then in about 1995, Malcolm effectively had a breakdown and was diagnosed with clinical depression. Violet, you've called that a terrible time in your statement. Can you tell us a little about how Malcolm was?
Malcolm sat in a chair. I used to say he was in his cave. He sat there and he couldn't bear light, and he used to sit like this all day long. Didn't talk, didn't communicate. He had weekly appointments at the doctor's, but which was a very short distance away, to be honest, but he wouldn't go out and meet anyone. He did not want to speak to anyone. And I took him there in the car. He was quite grudgingly going there on occasions. And Malcolm himself recalls, he will tell you, feeling a risk to us because of hallucinations. And I found that he had piled furniture against the door so as not to come out in case he would injure us, because he wasn't sure what was going to happen next, what was going on in his mind. And Malcolm can maybe tell you more about that, what he recalls of it.
Malcolm, what do you recall?
I confirm all that Vi has said, but I think I've erased a lot of it from my mind, my memory. It wasn't a good time. It was pretty awful. I think at that time I was commuting to London, wasn't I?
No, that was when you were in Yorkshire. You were still commuting down to London, but
Yes.
more on a maybe once a week basis as opposed to on a daily basis.
Yes.
You were working in Cheapside.
Yes.
You had an office
At
there.
Beckett House in Cheapside, yeah. I was very, very busy at work. I was director of a lot of the company's subsidiaries, UK subsidiaries. I had done a lot of company takeovers. I was doing far too much.
And when you had the breakdown that Violet's described, you could no longer face going into work.
Oh, it was hell. Going in, they were just wanting more directors. I was director of so many companies in the group, but the main board directors were throwing work at me all the time, piling it on. And I wanted other lawyers to be required. There was, a lot of work was being done in-house, me, and eventually they agreed to some work being sent out to outside firms.
There came a point when you were called into work to discuss your future there because of your ill health.
Yeah.
I think he was. It was actually because there was a company takeover. Aviva, the companies were merging, and they already had in-house lawyers, and they were having to compete for the same job in both companies.
Yeah.
And you've described, Violet, that Malcolm couldn't face going in for this, and you went in his place.
Well, we went to the doctor and he said, Malcolm can't go to Manchester, he can't travel to Manchester. He can't travel to Manchester, never mind have 3 days of interviews, which was what was required. There was psychometric testing and, you know, a day of interviews with this company and with that company. And he said he can't do it. So they said, well, if you don't show up, the other guy gets a job. Simple as that. And they said, you better come and talk to us then. And Malcolm said, I can't go, so you'll have to go in place of me. And I went there, and there was a table full of people from HR, company directors, lawyers. They were all there, and they presented me with 2 scenarios for Malcolm. He could retire on the grounds of ill health, and at this stage I think he was 49, and if he retired with an ill health pension, which was going to be a good pension, it was 2/3 of his salary, and which would take him up to then his retirement age, and I think his pension contributions would also be paid during that time. But he would have to have a medical every, I think it was 6 months. And if at any stage he was considered capable of doing a job, even, the words they used were, even being a lollipop man, that pension would cease. And the other alternative was that he take his pension contributions, which were 8 years at that point, and they would top it up with another 5 to bring him up to having made contributions to the age of 55, and he could take that. And I did say to them, I'm sure I know what his decision will be on that, but can I go home and present it to him before I make the final decision? And I think they gave me to the next morning. And Malcolm will tell you what he chose.
Retirement.
You took the second option that wouldn't require the constant medicals.
I was in no condition to carry such a burden, wholly unrealistic burden of work, working all hours as well. Would have been crazy.
I think you said to me, when I get better, I'll get a little job with one of the local solicitors and do a bit of conveyancing or something, you know, sometime in the future. We'll take that one.
That didn't happen. I think, Violet, you described Malcolm did a few months volunteering in a citizens' advice
I
bureau.
think it was longer than that. I think I'm
more.
wrong about that. I think it was longer.
Yes, some years as a volunteer.
Although at times
Yeah.
you
I
stopped.
used to get all the legal work, so I eventually stopped the CAB because I was really retirement age by then.
But you weren't able to go back to paid employment after that?
Not doing that sort of job, no. It would have been absurd.
And in terms of the depression which you were diagnosed with, your GP, I understand, told you that people with multiple illnesses such as the hepatitis C and the physical and mental consequences of that, would often tend to develop depression.
Yes.
You have never, in fact, received treatment for hepatitis C. You were seen at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary sometime in the 90s with a view to you embarking upon a course of interferon.
Yes.
But in the course of the investigations and prior to the treatment commencing, you were told that the hepatitis C had cleared.
Yes. I'm not sure they were saying it totally cleared, but the readings, whatever, the measurements, were far more favourable. Yeah.
So you didn't have interferon, and Violet, you've said in your statement you now know how lucky Malcolm was not to go on a course
Absolutely.
of interferon from everything that you've read and heard about it subsequently. Do you continue to have any monitoring of the condition of your liver?
No. No. It has been suggested, but I was a bit reluctant. And I've not been asked again.
And you've continued to experience a number of the symptoms that you'd previously endured: pain, fatigue, confusion.
A lot. Memory is not so good. A lot of pain, joint pain, but not because of bleeds. I haven't had many internal bleeds. I've had liver cancer, not liver cancer, colon cancer, and surgery for that.
You've alluded to this already, but one of the consequences of what happened in terms of you being given factor VIII and becoming infected is that you then began to refuse to take factor VIII at all. And that's really been your view ever since.
Well, I have had factor. I've had operations on both ankles. My left ankle's artificial, but one on the right got bits of metal holding it together. And the colon cancer operation was fairly major, and I had factor for that. But I am reluctant. And I think that's clear on my medical records.
And I think there's one occasion where you fell downstairs and put your head through a wall,
Well,
and you were insistent that you wouldn't take factor VIII.
yes. I think I was insistent. I'm told I was. I have little recollection.
I pulled him out from the wall. Fortunately, it wasn't a stone house like we'd lived in previously. It was a modern house with a timber frame, and he'd gone between the uprights. And I hauled him out, and I said, right, factor VIII for you. And he said, I'd rather die from a head injury than from HIV. I'm going to bed, and you can check my eyes every so often and make sure they're looking normal. And I thought, well, I don't have a lot of medical knowledge, really. I went down the village. I was in a rage, actually. I was very angry with them because I knew this time it was pretty serious. And I went down the village for a walk, I think to deep breathe a bit and calm down before I returned. And tackled him again. And I met the district nurse in the village, and she said, he has to go to York. So I came home and threatened him and said, right, taking you to York, and if you aren't going to go, I'm going to phone up and ask to speak to a haematologist and let them try and convince you. And after that, he kind of decided he would go, but he wouldn't have factor VIII. I don't know what he expected from them.
Violet, you've explained in your statement that about 5 years ago, when Malcolm was due to have an operation because of the cancer that he had, that surgery was cancelled at the last minute because of the hepatitis C diagnosis.
And possibly because of the risk of...
VCJD.
Yes.
Mm.
And so it was cancelled because they didn't have the necessary instruments, is what you were told. Malcolm was told he'd have to wait, that they needed to order fresh instruments, and there was going to be a period of delay in having this cancer-related surgery.
Yeah, the delay was such that, first of all, he'd missed the slot with his surgeon, who was then going to teach in Europe for a while. He had a commitment. And secondly, they simply couldn't get the instruments. They hadn't been manufactured. They had quite a long lead time and had to be ordered well in advance. Malcolm's haematologist had actually sent a letter to the surgical team saying you need a separate set of instruments for Malcolm because his instruments cannot be used on anyone else. And somehow nothing had happened until about 2 days before he was due to have his surgery. And the delay would have meant waiting for his cancer operation 1 year from the date of diagnosis.
You offered to use your savings to buy the instruments, or you contemplated that at
Yes,
least?
Malcolm suggested we should do that.
In the end, your daughter, who was working at a London hospital in cancer care, helped write a letter with the assistance of one of the consultants there, and you were offered surgery at an earlier date than might otherwise have been the case with a different surgeon.
Yes.
But Violet, you observed that the hepatitis C infection still causes problems 3 decades later. Violet, can I just ask you about the impact on you of Malcolm's illnesses? You, for a period of time, were effectively raising the children on your own.
Yes, when the children were small, I mean, Malcolm got his first bite of hepatitis, which was still affecting him when I had the baby. Although he did his best, I can recall phoning him and saying, you have to come home and help with this child because I can't cope anymore. He was a particularly difficult baby, and Malcolm did manage quite well then. Later on, when we had our daughter, he had had his second bout of hepatitis, and by then he had a great deal more pain. And he would come home and stuff himself with tramadol or whatever, and he really wasn't physically fit to contribute a lot, you know, to the children. I mean, if they were demanding, that's the last thing Malcolm needed. So I used to take them out a lot and keep them out of the way when he wasn't well.
And it's suggested, I think, in Malcolm's statement that when he had to retire early, as we've heard, you had to work full-time and you had to carry on working beyond retirement age.
Yes, I mean, probably by the time the children had gone off to university, I would have gone back to work full-time anyway, you know. But that just happened earlier, out of necessity, because our financial situation had changed.
Those are the questions I have for you both. Is there anything further that either of you would like to add?
I think you've covered everything.
Violet?
I would just like to say thank you to all the people who have fought to bring about this inquiry. And thank you to Sir Brian and to all of the team here who have been very supportive. And we hope, for the sake of all these people who aren't around anymore, and all the children who didn't get to live their lives, that some answers will come out of this that will give some comfort to those families who are left behind.
Thank you. Sir Brian.
Well, thank you both. And having you together, I think, has given us a vivid picture, a set of vivid pictures of significant incidents in what happened. Because you've each contributed in your own way and with slightly different recollections, but overall you've painted compelling pictures. And you, Malcolm, you've given us a fascinating insight into what you really think about some of the correspondence you've had.
Oh, I can add to that.
So thank you both.
Thank you.
We'll take a break until 1:45. 1:45.